what is consciousness? This is a repeatable sort of question that I ask from all my guests and researchers. And of course, it is one of the topics that is the most complex and the most talked about in the world today. Nobody knows what it is, but as per you, as per a neuroscientist, what is to you consciousness is, and why did evolution sort of chose us to make us sentient, and why not other beings such as plants or, other things?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. And as you rightly mentioned, that it is a very hot topic these days. And
Right.
especially like a lot of big names more recently in neuroscience have actually started exploring on this subject as well. Now, I would try to like draw a very simple example of explaining what I
Sure.
believe is consciousness.
Yeah.
Now, think of like a robot that you actually design yourself, and you draw some specific rules that you implement in that robot. For instance, just follow a white line, while you are walking. Take right, when you see a green signal. Take left when you see a red signal. And then one day, this robot actually does something new, which you have not taught that robot, for instance, right? Which, for example, the robot stops following the white line and stops, following the right direction when it sees the green signal. It actually starts going the other way around, and it starts exploring something new as well. And imagine what would happen if that robot you actually start. One day is actually, you can imagine like doing other tasks, such as complex tasks, let's say washing dishes, which you have not taught that robot. Right? Now, what is happening there is like, there is some material behind it. There is some sort of like matter behind it, and there is an underlying software which is running on it that you actually coded. And you can imagine like the robot must follow the specific rules that you design that algorithm with, and should not do anything else. Right? Now, with us as humans, you can imagine like in our case that we have a brain in which has neurons and quite some other stuff, which is the hardware of our brain, which is the hardware, let's say. And then there is a running software on it, which, for instance, is the neural networks, right, the processing, the learning, the sensory information, and then which leads to what we call as cognition or mind. Right? Now, consciousness, I believe, is the highest form of state of that cognition and mind, where we are actually doing things that which are way above and beyond to what we have learned from the data, or to what our neurons are hard coded with as a software. Right? Now, you can imagine, like, let's say we experience things day to day, bless you. So there are two levels to it. No worries. One is that you can imagine, like, we experience day-to-day things, which is, let's say you and I take a ride on a train, and we sit next to a window, and let's say we are going from Zurich to Geneva, and there are some beautiful views out there. And we actually see those beautiful mountains, and then we ask each other, can we describe that experience? Right? Now, my subjective experience is going to be different than yours, although we were looking at the exact same thing.
Same thing.
We were looking at the exact same thing. Now, what it actually means is like of course, it has to do with our previous learning as well, the way our brain is tuned already with past experiences as well. Right. What it actually means is like the emergent new responses and the experiences are still very different. But even for people, let's say, with absolute same past experiences, hypothetically speaking. Now, this is very interesting. What it actually means is like, you can imagine that there are thousands of ways to do a certain job. and let's say it is randomly chosen by a single brain to actually do it for some way, and then the other brain actually randomly selects to do it the other way. And almost always this is different, right? So there isn't a case where you actually share the same conscious experience together, right? That is unheard of. And I believe in that sense, you can imagine like we as human beings are conscious, or why evolution has actually selected us this way. This we can imagine like by comparing ourselves with plants, for instance, and other species. Now, and through a neuroscience perspective, you can imagine like there is some minimum baseline items that needs to be there for one to be conscious, right? So that baseline could be, for instance, that we have a higher cognition functions as individuals. We have a lot of neurons. So there has to be a reason that we have so many neurons in our brain. We have so many sensors as vision, auditory, and then so on. So there has to be a reason that, the evolution has selected us, that, we have these sensors. So there is an underlying baseline that needs to be there when it comes to anatomy and certain functionality, right? Where the consciousness is a possibility. And when we look at the plants, for instance, then they may not have evolved to that level. Part of the reason is like their role throughout those evolutionary experiences has been limited to a certain functionality with certain neurons or certain cell types, which are doing certain. For instance, they also take sensory information as input, right? So they take sunlight, they take water, right? And they actually respond as well towards the environment, similar to what we respond to. We take some information from the environment and then we respond. So, for instance, they sort of like release oxygen and then they take up the carbon dioxide. That's one function, and then they actually produce out as an output fruits as well. That's another function. So they multiply, right? And there are certain functionalities. If we look at we as human conscious beings and plants, there are some common things as well as inputs and outputs to high level. But then when we draw the basic distinction between like the underlying anatomical and role of specific regions in our brain and the amount of neurons and connections that we have is altogether different than as we compare to plants or anything else for that matter, any non-living being. So I believe you can imagine like initially this whole evolutionary experience has been subjective to like as sort of like keep on pruning and keep on selecting sort of like, with competition or whichever way we can call it. But over time, the most conscious beings that we know as we are have actually emerged as the ones who are actually doing these amazing things in the world. And part of the reason is that we have this specific advantage to us, which is a certain brain size and specific number of neurons and connections as well. But it doesn't always mean that the amount of neurons and connections is proportional to how conscious you are and how intelligent you are, for instance, because there are other beings as well, like elephants, for instance, and whales. True. They have such huge brains, far more huge than humans, for instance, right? But are they more intelligent being than our? That's a different discussion. But we can think of that nature has selected through a systematic way of like categorizing species in a certain way, where although we were selected as through this competition in a certain way, but at the same time, I believe there is some underlying baseline functionality that we had, that actually we emerged as beings who actually could go towards consciousness as an experience as compared to the other species, I believe. I don't know, maybe it does give you a flavor. I'm not an expert on consciousness.